So welcome again to Dharma in Pyjamas. It's an interesting topic today, very topical. It's about in relevance to the Black Lives Matter movement. And so the topic this morning is how Maudgalyayana was actually a black man and has been whitewashed out of history. And so I thought it's a really opportune time now to bring this to mind and redress this bit of injustice. So yes, the Black Lives Matter, and I was reading that we could even have quite a contemporary take on the Buddha's life in from a lens of particularly black people in America. So one of the things that I've been reading about was one of the people I was reading said, in a somewhat idle and somewhat serious question, has anyone ever tried explaining the Sanskrit epithet Buddha as the woke? As in, not just woke, but he is woke. What do you think? How does that work in the early 3rd millennium English? So describing or asking whether anyone's kind of thought of the Buddha as being woke, there is a translation, you know, there's a connection there between the fully awakened one and the use of the word woke for being awakened in terms of racism or sexism, gender discourse, all of those things, to be woke. So there is a really nice parallel happening there. And you could even go so far as to say, you know, in the text it's got in the quite archaic kind of language, you know, and the Buddha said, excellent, excellent. But if you wanted to put it into like contemporary terms, you could say, wow, the woke said, yo, dope, man. So in my readings with this, that it kind of made me think how our understanding of Buddhism is always through the lens of whatever our current circumstances are. And there is a tendency for our, you know, Buddhist classes to be through the lens of white middle class Australia, or what I've been reading, say, white middle class America. And so while we might say, oh, I'm not racist, actually it would be more honest to say, I don't want to be racist. Because from a position of privilege, as a white person, I can't actually say whether I'm racist or not. I'm not the one to say. Just like, you know, I can say, as a woman, when a guy says, oh, I'm not sexist, it's like, hang on a second, you're not the one to say. So I've found in our culture, particularly in Australia, many people say, oh, I'm not racist, but. So we just really got to kind of wipe that one out. So what I wanted to introduce was Maudgalyayana. So the two heart disciples of the Buddha, Sharitputra and Maudgalyayana. So I'm going to show you a picture of them. You might recognize they're often down the bottom here on either side of the Buddha, and Sharitputra there on our left, Maudgalyayana on the right. And occasionally Maudgalyayana is depicted as being blue, and I've always wondered why. There's another little picture of the two Buddha's heart disciples, these really famous statues. And of course, when they're painted gold, then there's no problem. And you know, the Buddha also is always depicted as gold with no skin color. So it kind of cuts across the whole racism thing. But occasionally, Maudgalyayana is depicted as blue. So I was trying to do some research about it. And what I found was that often the word in Sanskrit for blue and black is interchangeable. Blue, black, it's the same thing. And in the kind of the Indian color perception, dark and blue go together. In the Hindu tradition, Krishna means black, and Krishna is always depicted as blue. That the Buddha's hair was, you know, we're used to the description blue-black. So it's quite interesting that historically then, what clearly was black man now then turned to a blue man, and then was just turned into a pink man later on. Whitewashed out of history, as so many of these things happen. And you might kind of think, well, you know, how come no one ever said anything specifically about this? But if you go back to the time of the Buddha, people weren't organised so much by their actual skin colour, but by their caste. There was the caste system, and a little bit like our class system, and that was the predominant thing. So the untouchables class, which are now called the Dalits, they were kind of like the black men of India, the black people of India. But because at the time the predominant thing would have been the caste, then no one would have remarked whether Maudgalyayana was black or not. He probably was a noble or something, and so that wasn't the distinguishing factor. And then because that wasn't noted then of course, as history is written by the victors, then Maudgalyayana becomes a white man. Now, I had a little reading. Where is it? Maybe the next one. I'll just stop my little screen share for a moment. So the other reason that I wanted to bring this up was that there is an Australian connection too, now that there's this big upsurgence of the plight of black people throughout the world, and particularly in America, but what about here in Australia? Our black brothers and sisters, our, in particular, First Peoples, Australian Indigenous population. And it's kind of interesting that it's only when these protests are happening in America that we start as a culture, Australian, you know, contemporary culture, looking at what's happening at home. So Australian Indigenous people are the most incarcerated race in the world. Isn't that terrible? That's on us. 3% of the Australian population, but 20% in jail. And 50% of juveniles in detention in Australia, in jail, are Indigenous. So, I mean, there's that, which is just a shame and a blight on us. But there's also a really strong connection and parallel between the Aboriginal teachings and, in particular, Buddhist Tantra. And just in the one tiny little tour that we got to do at Uluru, when His Holiness the Dalai Lama was teaching it at Uluru, giving a talk there and visited. And the way that they described how there are these 4 different ways of telling the same story. So the first level is what you tell to kiddies, and then to the teenagers, and then to the men in their prime, and then the elders. And it was really similar to the 4 stages of Tantra, how you describe the world with another layer of nuance and depth. Such incredible parallels. And then just recently I saw a documentary on telly, and the almost like literally a sand mandala in the sand, and the way they were putting each of the components in there, and then at the end swept it all up, just like in the Tibetan system doing the sand mandala. Each little grain has significance, and in the end sweeping it all up, the winds of impermanence. So there is a particular connection that we have to this whole thing that's happening at the moment on many, many levels. Okay, so why is it important to acknowledge? Well, one of the things is that even though we say, you know, all sentient beings are equal, what we're saying is all sentient beings are equal in wanting happiness and not wanting suffering. but we're not equal in opportunity. And so from say my position of privilege, it's easy for me to kind of just gloss over that and go, well, we're all equal, so what's the problem? But again, it's not for me to say whether there's a problem. It's for the people experiencing the problem or not to let us know. So, you know, we look through our lens of privilege, whatever it is. And I think this, as a Buddhist, this also extends to other things that we can look at, that we look through our lens of privilege of being a human being and ignore the plight of other life forms even, you know, the plight of animals, the plight of the planet. And all of this comes down to how we grasp at our identity as being us. So when we are born karmically into a position of privilege, we assume that's us. We kind of grasp at inherence that is us. We don't recognize, oh, that's the fruits of my past karma. It's not me at all. It's like my inheritance that I'm enjoying. And the more kind of privilege that we have, the more oblivious we become. So I really didn't want that to happen to me, because I don't want to be a racist and I don't want to be sexist. So what can I do about it? One of the things is to recognize that if you ever have that thought that goes, oh, well, that's just their karma, that's a total bastardization of karma. Because actually karma is about the future. Not so much about the past. Past already happened. Karma is mostly about the future. So from my position of privilege, how I treat others is how in the future I'm going to be treated. So that's the wake-up call, isn't it? So it reminded me about this story of Venerable Robina when she was working in the prisons in America and a lot of time on death row. And so she was talking to a bunch of course, what are mostly black men in America incarcerated, and they were having a discussion about karma, and one of them kind of, you know, it dawned on him, oh my gosh, so does that mean that I could be reborn as a white man? And he was completely horrified. You know, how white men are treating him now, then next he'll be born as a white man, or, you know, which way. And then Venerable Robina was saying, I didn't have the heart to tell him that he might also be reborn as a white woman as well. So when we're talking about karma, we've got to be really careful, because it's how we treat others now is what's going to happen to us in the future. So if that isn't any kind of incentive just for oneself, I mean, that's pretty much where we can start, isn't it? And then develop it from there. One of the other stories that I heard was, so it's not so much a Buddhist story, but you know, when we're saying, well, you know, isn't everyone equal? It's kind of like if you're at a funeral of a child and someone's giving a eulogy about the child, you know, and how all of their wonderful qualities and what joy they gave, and someone else in the back stands up and goes, yeah, but all children are important. It's kind of like not quite appropriate. And this kind of usurping the situation at hand happens really often. And it happens when we feel our own position as being threatened. And we feel threatened because we're identifying with our position as us. So this whole thing really cuts right to that deep egocentricity where we grasp at something that we think is us. In one of the readings, you know, so we so identify, for instance, with being white that we can't even conceive of anything else. But one of the ladies was saying, well, you know, what if you just took some white skin and just had a pile of white skin on the floor? That wouldn't have the power, would it? So there's a whole lot more in there. And one of the things that really touched me was a lady who was telling a story about being in a meditation group in America, and you know, she black woman and hardly any other black women in the class, and they were doing a meditation on mindfulness of the body. And you know, becoming aware of all the different functions and the processes, and so kind of being led through the meditation, feeling the bones and the blood coursing through your body and the muscles and the heat, and feeling the skin, the sensation of the air on the skin. And then she started thinking, wow, this could be really profound, because my skin has affected my whole life. I wonder where they're going to go with this. And so the person leading the meditation just didn't even notice, just kind of glossed over and just treated the skin as just being a physical thing, rather than this whole dependent arising of history and acknowledgement and no acknowledgement and oppression, all associated just with the color of skin. So it's like, because the person leading the meditation came from this position of privilege, didn't notice that there was anything else going on. And so she really felt like there was a whole story missed there in that meditation, where she could have really got into what is this notion of race, how does it affect us? So in Buddhism, there are two truths, absolute and relative. At the absolute level, skin color is immaterial. But at the relative level, racism is real and causes very real suffering. Understanding the causes of suffering and finding a path out of that suffering, isn't that what Buddhism is all about? So on a level of absolute truth, race does not exist. But in the realm of relative truth, the illusion that race is a stable, immutable category affects the lived experience of beings. So the effects, they're real. We can't kind of just kind of argue them out of existence. So I wanted to bring a little bit of experience into this. So here's my next screen share. And so for those of you who've already seen it, it's going to be interesting, because even though you've already seen it, the illusion still happens, doesn't it? For those of you who haven't seen it, just have a look at these two things and just kind of, describe what you're seeing. Two buttons, they look like computer keys, don't they? Computer keyboard buttons of some sort. White button and a dark grey button. Got a nice blue sky, a pretty mucky looking carpet, probably a carpet from an RSL, or it might be some computer generated ground. It's something like that. One's called A and one's called B. Do you see anything else? Okay, so now with this optical illusion, what we're seeing, and pretty much we're thinking seeing is believing, right? Isn't it? So now get your finger and hold your finger over the horizon line between both of the buttons, so that the horizon between the sky and the carpet and between the two buttons disappears. Now, what do you see? Take your finger away. What do you see? Put your finger there. Oh, you probably have to close one eye to do it. So this is just a simple optical illusion, but doesn't it just blow your mind? So appearance and, the relative truth, the appearance, and the ultimate truth, they exist simultaneously. But it's very difficult to keep them simultaneously in mind. So this is a wonderful metaphor, for instance, for race. That when you're looking at ultimate truth, you take away all of those distinguishing characteristics and things. Yes, they're the same. So it's like our mind has no gender, no age, no color, no race. But we're not just a mind existing, nowhere. We're also a dependent arising. We're a product of our environment and our karma. and our background and all of our emotional baggage and the color of our skin. And when we have all of that surrounding us, then yes, there is a difference. And that has consequences. So what happens, of course, because we grasp at inherence, we think that difference is real and permanent and ultimate, but it's not. The effects affect us, but it's not the ultimate truth when you put your finger and close your eye. And just how difficult it is for us, you know, because we see things in a context, we experience things in context, it's very difficult to bring to mind the ultimate truth. And when we first meet people, what we first see is difference. It's very rare to see the similarities. We're just automatically drawn to the difference. And the problem comes not in that there is difference. That is good. It's good to have whole different cultures. The problem is thinking that that's real, and then what racism does, thinking that one is more important than the other. So I really love this because right here, you know, we can just see how it works. Just as an optical illusion how it works, let alone our life, let alone racism. The other thing, of course, about optical illusions, there's this little frisson, isn't there, of when it does your head in. It's kind of exciting. It kind of, you know, turns you inside out for a moment. And that is that experience of having your solid grasping at reality as being true and real and everything being shaken. And it causes delight. And also, just like really good magic tricks, it causes fear. Both of those things. So it shows that it's working, that it's shaking that tight grip that we have on inherence, thinking things are inherently true. So with this one, when we look at this optical illusion, we can see, yes, Black Lives Matter, and it's important to place that importance there because of the context, because of the suffering involved. Then you need to place more importance. You can't go, oh, well, white lives matter too. That's totally inappropriate, and this is why. Because the context actually flavors our whole reality, and that's valid. All that suffering, that is valid. So let's see, instead of saying, you know, I'm not racist, just like I was saying before, it's better to say I don't want to be racist and to work on what's behind racism. And from a Buddhist point of view, it's that grasping at inherent reality. And if we can actually work at that, it will liberate us not just from racism, but from all the isms, from sexism, from harming others, from the very causes of suffering. While we don't do that, then we're kind of oblivious, like that person leading the meditation and didn't even think about, wow, the color of skin actually, it's a different experience for different people. Now, there was something else I wanted to read you as well. Where is it? Can't find it. What was the other thing that I wanted to say? Yeah, so when we come to this, when we've got our relative truth and our ultimate truth, and to not kind of bastardize the teachings on karma, but to actually use this. If we really understand relative truth and ultimate truth, it makes us more compassionate. And it shows clearly that if we have a position of privilege or power, it's our responsibility to do something because we're there and we're the ones that can do something. So even though from a relative point of view, you know, our mind, no age, no gender. So there's no sexism when it comes to the mind. No race. You you know, it's formless, without shape. It's that kind of pure experience. But nevertheless, a person is made up of a body and mind. We're embodied beings. And so that, you know, body and mind and the person imputed to it. Living within our environment in the context. And in there is the key, because we impute identity. And, you know, even you know, nowadays you can't tell, say for instance, is someone Aboriginal by the colour of their skin, because the colour may have gone, but there's still Aboriginal identity. So it kind of correlates completely with this Buddhist understanding of what it mostly depends on is the name, what we impute. And so if we've imputed that we're Aboriginal, or if we've imputed that we're white, that makes the reality. It's not an ultimate reality, but it's a relative one, and that is valid. And then it has consequences. We experience the results of that. And so it's important that we acknowledge that we give that as much due. So race, you know, depends mostly on how we identify, not the, you know, the various parts of what colour we are, or, you know, what country we're brought up in. Yes, it's a dependent arising. And because of that, it has effects, and we experience those effects. But it's not an ultimate truth, and that way it shows our way out. So what we can do on a relative level is redress the balance. And, you know, in the Black Lives Matter movement at the moment, there is the, you know, the face masks that we're wearing, you know, for the coronavirus. And a lot of people in America have put "I can't breathe" on those face masks. And it's kind of become this rallying cry, hasn't it? And it means a lot more than just the "I can't breathe" of the policeman putting his knee on the neck of George Floyd. What it means is, like, I can't breathe, I'm an oppressed people, doesn't it? It's got this incredible depth to it. And from a Buddhist point of view, it also has a lot of depth, because in one of the vows that we're supposed to, you know, repeat each day, become really familiar. I will liberate those not liberated. I will give breath to those unable to breathe. I mean, so that's on the Bodhisattva path, that is our job, to liberate those not liberated and give breath to those unable to breathe, including doing whatever it takes to support the Black Lives Matter movement. So our last picture, here's Maudgalyayana depicted as blue-black. Maha Maudgalyayana, the great Arhat. And then a picture that redresses the balance a little bit. So often described as Maudgalyayana having a dark complexion. So we've got to just put it back in again, a relative truth. Let's have Maudgalyayana depicted as blue or as black. And in fact, you know, as Jan Willis was saying, now, the Black Baptist Buddhist, Jan Willis in America, connects the ancient Indian caste system to the modern situation of racial oppression in the United States. She writes, when the details of the Buddha's life were reviewed, he became even more of an inspiration. For he was a man who in actual practice rejected the systematic oppression of his country's people by denouncing caste and by allowing women to enter into his community of practitioners. Both actions were extremely radical, even revolutionary for his time. He was a man who left his youthful life of luxury to commune with diverse people of whatever caste or gender, so long as they too sought a disciplined path to liberation. Because of the Buddha's teachings and his own life example, many African American children of the civil rights movement have been finding their way to Buddhism. Yet, as has often been the case before, we are doing this without much fanfare or even recognition, once again being made almost invisible. So, Jan Willis. So I think, you know, because it's we have the opportunity, we have the responsibility to bring the invisible and make it visible again, and not have Maudgalyayana whitewashed out of history, but put back right in his rightful place, which is one of the true heart disciples of the Buddha. I mean, how incredibly inspiring. So I'd like to dedicate the merits today of this kind of little meander through racism and privilege, that just like Lama Zopa Rinpoche says, you know, we have this perfect human rebirth. We have a human rebirth and a real interest in a spiritual life, a real interest in helping others, and, you know, developing this bodhisattva attitude that I've got to become fully awakened, enlightened, woke, for the benefit of all others, to liberate others, to liberate all sentient beings from their suffering, from racism, from sexism. So as a human being, now the position that we find ourselves in, we have everything. We're in the ultimate position of privilege and power. Whether we recognize it or not, it's like we're holding this jewel in our hand and we don't even know. And because we have this opportunity, we must use it, regardless of whether we feel ready or not. So Lama Zopa Rinpoche said it's like we're walking along the edge of a cliff and a blind person is running headlong towards the end of a cliff. We have to stop them because we're there, not because, oh, I don't know if I'm ready or not. It's just because the fact we are there, we have a responsibility to help. So the same thing, instead of kind of having kind of the leisure of a white man's burden or a white man's guilt, to really acknowledge we have a position of power, so we have to use it to benefit others. So that's what I wanted to say. Have a wonderful rest of the week, helping, liberating, bringing all beings to enlightenment.